The Gospel of Mary Magdalene contains a passage that the Church classified as heresy within a century of its composition, copied it anyway into at least 3 separate manuscript traditions, then spent the better part of 1500 years pretending those copies did not exist. The British Library holds one, the Coptic Museum in Cairo holds another, a third, the Berlin Codex, sat in a German antiquities dealer's collection for decades before scholars even recognised what they were looking at. These are not marginal documents, they are not forgeries. They're among the earlier surviving Christian writings we possess, predating several books of what we now call the New Testament, and they describe something that should stop you in your tracks, a specific numerical and calendrical teaching that Jesus gave privately to his disciples, a teaching about the number 13, about the 6th day of the week, and about why those two things combined represented the single most dangerous idea the early authorities wanted removed from human religious consciousness. That teaching, in its fullness, is what this documentary is about, not the superstition, not the horror movies, not the pop culture mythology of a cursed day that hotel chains and airline companies spend enormous sums accommodating because so many passengers refuse to fly and so many guests refuse to sleep on that floor. All of that is the surface. All of that is, in fact, the mechanism. It is the outcome of a successful millennia-long campaign to take something that early Gnostic Christians considered among the most spiritually charged combinations in their entire cosmological framework and convert it into something people fear, mock, or dismiss without ever asking a single question about where the fear actually came from. Spend the next few hours with this material. In that time, you will move through 5 distinct territories. You will start in the historical record, the actual manuscripts, the actual dates, the actual documented decisions made by actual church councils. Because the story of how this knowledge was suppressed is, counterintuitively, extremely well documented. The people who buried it wrote down why they were doing it. Then you will move into the cosmological framework itself. What did Gnostic Christianity actually teach about the number 13? And why does that teaching map so precisely onto ancient astronomical knowledge that modern researchers have spent decades trying to explain? Then you will go into the practices, not vague gestures toward the spiritual, specific step-by-step methods drawn from the Nag Hammadi texts, from the Berlin Codex, from the Pistis Sophia, and from the parallel traditions preserved in Hermetic philosophy and the Kabbalah that survived precisely because they encoded the same information in different symbolic languages. Then you will hear from contemporary practitioners, people who have worked with these methods across multiple years and who have documented their experiences with the kind of specificity that allows you to compare your own results. And finally, you will receive a complete practice framework, a structured progression that takes someone with zero background in any of this and walks them over 30 days into a working relationship with these ideas that is empirically testable. That phrase, empirically testable, is important. It's not a concession to skeptics. It is the actual standard the Gnostic texts themselves demanded. The Gospel of Thomas, found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, along with 51 other texts that the Church had worked very hard to eliminate from existence, opens with a direct challenge. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. That is not a promise about heaven. That is a promise about direct, verifiable experience. The text is asking you to test it. That same empirical ethos runs through the Gospel of Mary, through the Gospel of Philip, through the Apocryphon of John. These are not documents of blind faith. They are documents of methodology. And the methodology they describe for working with the Friday the 13th combination specifically is one that has a traceable lineage, a documented history, and, for those who engage with it seriously, measurable effects. Begin with what is most surprising. The people who made Friday the 13th feared were not confused. They were not superstitious. They were not acting from ignorance. They knew exactly what they were doing, and several of them wrote it down. Pope Gregory XIII, the same pope who gave us the Gregorian calendar we still use today, replacing the Julian calendar in 1582, convened a series of theological consultations in the 1570s that centred substantially on the problem of what historians now call calendrical heterodoxy. This was not about Friday the 13th specifically. It was about the entire question of time, of how human beings measure time, and of what it means spiritually when a culture's calendar aligns or misaligns with natural astronomical cycles. The shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar was presented as a technical correction, a matter of ensuring that Easter fell in the right seasonal relationship to the spring equinox, and technically that is true, but the consultations reveal something else. The advisors who pushed hardest for the Gregorian reform also pushed consistently for the permanent marginalisation of the 13-month lunar calendar that various heretical and folk traditions across Europe continued to use. They did not want a calendar that counted 13 months, they wanted 12, and they had very specific theological reasons for that preference, which will become clear once you understand what the Gnostic framework actually taught about the difference between 12 and 13. The story that most people know about Friday the 13th, if they know any history at all, is the story of the Knights Templar. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France, who was deeply in debt to the Templars and had been denied membership in their order, issued secret orders that were carried out simultaneously across France at dawn. Hundreds of Templars were arrested. The charges were extensive: heresy, idol worship, obscene initiation rites, financial corruption, spitting on the cross. Most historians today regard the majority of these charges as fabricated, extracted under torture, and politically motivated. Philip wanted the Templars' wealth. The Pope, Clement V, who was effectively Philip's political dependent, provided ecclesiastical cover. But here is what most tellings of this story leave out. The date was not arbitrary. Philip's advisors knew it. The Templars themselves knew it. There is correspondence, preserved in the Vatican secret archives and analysed at length by scholars including Malcolm Barber in his exhaustive 1994 study of the Templar trials, that shows the Templar leadership had been warned something was coming and had made preparations accordingly. The most important documents, the most sensitive materials had been moved. Ships had departed from La Rochelle, the Templars' primary Atlantic port, in the days immediately before October 13th. No one knows with certainty what was on those ships. What historians do know is that the Templars had, in the years leading up to their suppression, accumulated substantial contact with Islamic, Jewish, and Eastern Christian scholarly traditions. Contact made possible by their presence in the Crusader states, their relationships with Arab scholars and Kabbalistic teachers, and their control of banking routes that ran through the most intellectually diverse cities in the medieval world. The Templars knew that Friday the 13th was not unlucky. That much we can establish with reasonable confidence. The question is what they knew it actually was. To understand that, you have to go back much further than 1307. You have to go back to the intellectual world from which early Gnostic Christianity emerged, a world that was not primarily Jewish or primarily Greek, but was a synthesis, a meeting point of Platonic philosophy, Pythagorean mathematics, Jewish apocalypticism, Egyptian theology, and Zoroastrian cosmology that produced in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era one of the most sophisticated spiritual philosophies the ancient world ever generated. The Gnostic systems, and there were many, which is itself important, shared a basic cosmological architecture. They agreed that the material world was not the creation of the highest divine principle. The highest divine principle, which they called by various names, most commonly the monad, the one, or the pleroma, the fullness, was infinite, perfect, and fundamentally unknowable by the human intellect. What human beings experience as the physical universe was the creation of a lower order of divine beings, the demiurge and the archons, who had themselves emanated from the higher divine reality through a complicated process of creative error and spiritual descent. The archons, a Greek word meaning rulers or authorities, were the administrators of this lower creation. They enforced its laws, they maintained its structures, they presided over what the texts called the 8 heavens, or, in more elaborate systems, the 12 spheres. 12. That number appears constantly in Gnostic cosmology, and it appears in a very specific context. The 12 archons corresponded to the 12 signs of the zodiac. The material world in this framework was a 12-part structure, a 12-sphere prison of determinism in which human souls were caught. The zodiacal signs were not just constellations, they were the mechanisms of fate, the instruments through which the archons exercise control over human destiny. Birth into the material world meant being subject to one or more of the 12 spheres. Existing in the material world meant navigating their influences. The entire spiritual project of Gnostic practice was liberation from this 12-fold system, escape from the 12 spheres back to the monad, back to the fullness, back to what they called the 13th eon. Pause on that phrase, the 13th eon. It appears in multiple Gnostic texts, in the Gospel of Judas, another Nag Hammadi text, one that caused enormous controversy when its translation was published in 2006. Jesus specifically promises Judas that he will surpass all of them and will ascend to the holy generation. The text describes this generation as dwelling in the 13th aeon, explicitly distinct from and beyond the 12 archonic spheres. Elaine Pagel's and Karen King's scholarly analysis of the Gospel of Judas, published by Yale University Press, traces this 13th aeon concept through multiple Gnostic texts and finds it consistently representing the same thing, the realm of divine reality that exists beyond the 12-part structure of material fate. The number 13 in this framework was not arbitrary, it was structurally necessary. If 12 represents the complete archonic system, then 13 represents the first number beyond that system. 13 is the consciousness that has exceeded the material structure. 13 is what happens when you add monad awareness, pure divine consciousness, to the 12-part world of material existence. 12 plus 1 does not equal 13 in ordinary arithmetic only. In Gnostic cosmology, it represents a qualitative transformation, the moment when deterministic existence is transcended by something that cannot be contained within the 12 spheres. This is why the number 13 was feared by the authorities who opposed Gnostic Christianity. Not because of superstition, because it was a code. When early Gnostic communities counted 13 members in a gathering, 13 lunar months in a year, 13 as the sacred number of their practice, they were encoding their entire theological program in a single digit. They were saying, "We are oriented toward that which lies beyond your system of control. We are cultivating the consciousness that your 12 spheres cannot contain. The calendar dimension of this cannot be overstated." One of the most consistently documented aspects of Gnostic and early heterodox Christian practice was the use of the 13-month lunar calendar. This calendar, which divides the solar year into 13 months of approximately 28 days each, corresponding to the 13 complete lunar cycles that occur in a solar year, was not a Christian invention. It is ancient. Versions of it appear in the Egyptian sacred calendar, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican timekeeping, in Celtic and Norse traditional calendars, and in the Jewish calendar's complex relationship between lunar months and solar adjustment. The Hebrew calendar, in fact, preserves the 13-month structure through its system of intercalation. In certain years, a 13th month called Adar II is added to align the lunar and solar cycles. The sacred feminine element of this is explicit in the Jewish tradition. The months are lunar, the moon is grammatically feminine in Hebrew. Urea is masculine, but Levana, the more poetic word for moon, is feminine. And the 13-month structure was explicitly associated by Kabbalistic commentators with the 13 divine attributes of mercy described in Exodus 34. When the Church standardized the 12-month solar calendar as the only legitimate way to measure Christian time, it was not making a neutral astronomical decision. It was making a theological decision. It was removing from official Christian consciousness the experiential reality of living in 13-cycle time, of feeling the year as 13 rather than 12, of having one's sense of temporal rhythm synchronized with the moon rather than purely with the sun. And because the moon has been associated with the feminine principle across virtually every ancient culture in the world, in Greek mythology, Selene and Artemis, in Roman mythology, Luna and Diana, in Egyptian theology, Isis and Hathor, in Mesopotamian theology, Nana and Inanna. The removal of the 13-month calendar was simultaneously the removal of a temporal structure that organized human experience around feminine rhythmic principles. Friday does not need this calendar to be significant, but it deepens when you understand the calendar context. The 6th day of the week derives its name, in virtually every Western European language, from the divine feminine principle. In English, Friday comes from the Old English Frigidag, the day of Frigg or Freya, the two primary Norse goddesses, both associated with love, wisdom, magic, and the capacity for prophetic sight. In German it is Freitag, Freya's day. In French it is Vendredi, the day of Venus. In Italian Venerdì, in Spanish Viernes. In Portuguese Sexta-feira, literally the 6th day, preserving the Roman numerical structure. The Latin dies Veneris, Venus's day, is the template from which the Romance language versions derive, and Venus, as the Romans understood her, was not simply a goddess of romantic love. She was the divine feminine principle in its cosmic aspect, the force of attraction, connection, beauty, generative creativity, and what the Neoplatonists called eros in its widest sense, the fundamental drive of reality toward unity and completion. The Gnostic identification of Friday as the day of Sophia is directly continuous with this tradition. Sophia, whose name simply means wisdom in Greek, was the central feminine divine figure in most Gnostic systems. She was not peripheral. She was in many texts the most important figure in the entire Gnostic mythology. The Pistis Sophia, one of the longest surviving Gnostic texts running to more than 300 pages in translation, is entirely organized around Sophia's journey. She is the divine wisdom who, in a moment of creative excess or spiritual ambition, reaches beyond her proper place in the divine order and falls into the material world. Her fall is the origin of the material cosmos. Her redemption, her return to the pleroma, is the goal of all Gnostic practice, and the texts describe her as having a special relationship with time, with the rhythms of the cosmos, with the movements of the planets and stars. The connection to Friday is this. In the Gnostic planetary scheme, which mapped the 7 classical planets onto the 7 days of the week, a system that predates Christianity and goes back to Babylonian and Egyptian astronomy, Venus governs Friday. Venus, as a planet, was in ancient astronomy the most consistently associated with the divine feminine principle. Its orbital pattern, its appearance as both morning star and evening star, its brilliant visibility, its mathematical properties. Venus traces a 5-pointed star, a pentagram, in its orbital relationship with Earth over an 8-year cycle. All of these characteristics made it the most symbolically loaded object in the ancient night sky, and in Gnostic astronomy, Venus occupied a specific position in the planetary spheres. It was one of the 7 archonic spheres. Yes, but it was also the sphere most recently emanated from the higher divine reality, the sphere closest to the transcendent realm, the sphere through which Sophia's light most directly penetrated the material world. Friday, in the Gnostic framework, was not just the day named after Venus. It was the day when the planetary influence most conducive to Sophia's work was at its peak. It was the day when the veil between the Archonic-controlled material world and the higher divine reality was at its thinnest, not because of magic in the fairy tale sense, but because of a specific theological claim about how divine influence moves through the structure of time. Combine Friday with 13, take the day of Sophia, the day when her influence is most directly felt, when the feminine divine principle is at its peak resonance in material time, and combine it with the number that represents liberation from the 12 archonic spheres. What do you get? You get what the Gospel of Mary calls the day of maximum liberation potential. You get the temporal coordinate at which the practice of liberation from archonic determinism is most effectively undertaken. You get the day that, if you understand the Gnostic framework at all, would be the most threatening possible day to the archonic system and its administrators. And so it was inverted. It was made the most feared day, the one day you avoid. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, to be clear about the text being referenced here, survives in 3 manuscript fragments. The most complete, the Berlin Codex, catalogued as Papyrus Berlinensis 8502, was purchased in Cairo in 1896 by a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt, but it was not published until 1955, nearly 60 years after its discovery, because of academic disagreements, 2 world wars, and the peculiar reluctance that seems to attend any Gnostic text that gives Mary Magdalene a prominent theological role. 2 additional Greek fragments were discovered at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, site of one of the most important papyrus finds in archaeological history, and are housed at Oxford and in Florence, respectively. Karen King of Harvard Divinity School produced the definitive scholarly translation and analysis in 2003. What the Gospel of Mary describes, in its surviving portions, is a post-resurrection dialogue in which Jesus appears to the disciples and delivers a series of teachings that the text frames as the most important, most secret, and most systematically suppressed of everything he taught. The surviving text is frustratingly incomplete. Pages 6 through 10 and pages 14 through 18 are entirely missing. But what remains is extraordinary. Jesus speaks directly about the nature of the soul, the structure of the cosmos, the meaning of sin, and the path to liberation. He identifies the primary obstacle to human spiritual development as what he calls darkness, which functions in the text almost identically to what other Gnostic texts call the archonic influence, the gravitational pull of material existence that keeps consciousness identified with the body and its appetites rather than with its divine origin. After Jesus departs in the Gospel of Mary, Mary Magdalene addresses the grieving disciples and delivers a series of teachings that Jesus had given her privately. Teachings that Peter and Andrew reject, because they cannot accept that a woman would have received the most advanced instruction. This narrative structure is itself significant. The text is making a specific claim, the knowledge that is most threatening to established hierarchies, the knowledge that most directly challenges the authority structures of religious officialdom, was transmitted through the feminine, through Sophia in the cosmic register, through Mary in the historical register. The teaching about 13 appears in one of the surviving fragments, in a context that connects it explicitly to the 12 disciples. There were 12 who walked with him in the visible way, and he was the 13th. And he did not walk only in the visible way. He walked in the way that the 12 could not see, could not report, could not contain within their understanding. For 12 is the number of what can be contained within structure, and he was the one who could not be contained. The parallel with the Last Supper tradition is unmistakable and deliberate. 13 people at a table, the meal that preceded the Passion, the gathering that the early church in its eventual canonical form both preserved and defanged, preserved the image, removed the cosmological meaning. Because if you understand the Gnostic significance of 13 at that table, the Last Supper becomes something other than a farewell dinner. It becomes a deliberate act of consciousness technology, a gathering of 12 archonic sphere navigators, people who are working through the 12-fold material world, each operating through their own zodiacal and planetary influences, in the presence of the one who operates beyond all 12 spheres. And the text in the Gospel of Mary is explicit about what this creates, a frequency field in its terminology that the archonic powers cannot penetrate. The language of frequency is anachronistic. The text does not use that word, but the concept is entirely present. The Gnostic term used in various manuscripts is sometimes translated as resonance, sometimes as harmony, sometimes as the sound that the powers cannot hear. The underlying Greek and Coptic terms carry the sense of a vibrational or qualitative state that the archonic forces are simply not equipped to engage with. It is outside their operational range. The 13th consciousness, by its nature, emits a signal that the 12-sphere system cannot detect, cannot interfere with, cannot disrupt. This is not primitive magic. This is a sophisticated philosophical claim about the relationship between states of consciousness and states of reality. The Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, who was a contemporary of the early Gnostics, whose work at Alexandria represents the high-water mark of late ancient philosophical spirituality, and who had complicated but illuminating disagreements with the Gnostic schools, makes a comparable argument in the Enneads. He describes what he calls the One as a principle that is beyond being, not a thing that exists in the ordinary sense, but the principle from which existence derives. And he argues that the human soul's capacity to turn toward the One depends on its ability to temporarily disengage from the lower levels of reality. The soul does not become different in these moments. It becomes more fully what it already is. And in those moments of greater alignment with its own deepest nature, it is genuinely operating at a different level of reality, one that the lower levels cannot easily interfere with. The Gnostic version of this insight was more dualistic and more dramatically cosmic than Plotinus preferred, but the underlying epistemological claim is the same. There are qualitatively different modes of consciousness, and they have real consequences for what is possible in one's experience of reality. The Friday 13 combination in the Gnostic practice was about deliberately creating conditions for one of these higher modes of consciousness to become available now. Before going further into the practice itself, it is necessary to address the two questions that skeptical, evidence-minded people most often raise at this point in the discussion. The first question is, how do we actually know what the early Gnostics believed and practiced? Aren't we reading texts that are themselves interpretations, translations of translations, filtered through centuries of scholarly bias? The second question is, even if the historical claims are accurate, why should we think that the practices described in these texts actually do anything? Isn't this ultimately just elaborate mythology dressed up as technique? Both questions are legitimate and important, and both deserve serious answers. On the first question, the scholarly situation is in fact much better than popular accounts of Gnosticism usually suggest. The Nag Hammadi library, discovered in 1945, and whose story deserves its own documentary, involving a blood feud, a murdered man, and some codices used as kindling before a local schoolteacher realised their potential significance, gave scholars access to 52 texts, most of them previously known only from the hostile descriptions of early church heresiologists like Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Epiphanius. Having the actual texts rather than the opponents' accounts of them was transformative, and the scholarly work on these texts produced by institutions including Harvard Divinity School, Claremont Graduate University, the Coptic Museum in Cairo, the Institute for Coptology at the Free University of Berlin, and dozens of other academic centres across the world, represent some of the most rigorous textual scholarship of the late 20th century. The translations we now have are not guesses. They are the product of decades of engagement with specific manuscripts, specific linguistic forms, specific contextual evidence. The discovery of the Gospel of Judas, announced to the world in 2006 after a remarkable and sometimes troubling odyssey through the antiquities market, added another major text and confirmed patterns that scholars had already identified in the Nag Hammadi materials. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia. These texts are in genuine conversation with each other, reflecting a coherent, if internally diverse, religious movement with specific practices, specific cosmological claims, and specific reasons for those claims. On the second question, why should the practices do anything? This is where the research gets genuinely interesting, because modern neuroscience and psychology have, largely independently of any engagement with Gnostic studies, developed frameworks that provide plausible mechanistic accounts of why several of the key Gnostic techniques might produce real experiential effects. The practice of gathering, of convening with a specific intentional group, oriented toward a shared purpose, has well-documented effects on individual psychology and physiology. The literature on social baseline theory, developed by James Cohen at the University of Virginia, demonstrates that the nervous system's fundamental threat assessment is calibrated to the presence and quality of social connection. When we gather with genuine intentionality, not just physically proximate but aligned in purpose and attention, the nervous system registers a qualitatively different signal than it does in ordinary social interaction. Vagal tone improves, cortisol regulation improves, the capacity for what Cohen calls resource sharing, the cooperative use of attention and cognitive processing across group members, expands significantly. This is not mysticism, this is neurophysiology. But it maps remarkably cleanly onto the Gnostic claim that gathering with conscious intentionality creates a field that differs qualitatively from ordinary social existence. The practice of invocation, of deliberately calling the attention to a specific quality of consciousness, in this case what the Gnostic texts call Sophia, or monad awareness, has a robust psychological literature that is typically discussed under the heading of intentional attention direction, or, in its clinical applications, contemplative practice. The research on contemplative practice is now extensive enough to have been reviewed in meta-analyses. A 2014 meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin by Richard Goyle and colleagues at Johns Hopkins, reviewing 47 randomized controlled trials of mindfulness-based interventions, found moderate evidence for improvement across multiple outcome measures, including anxiety, depression, and pain. More relevant to the Gnostic framework is research on what psychologists call self-transcendent experiences in which the ordinary boundary of selfhood temporarily dissolves, and the person reports contact with something larger than their individual identity. David Yaden at Johns Hopkins has mapped the neuroscience of these states and found consistent patterns. They involve altered activity in the default mode network, the brain's self-referential processing system, activation of areas associated with integration of sensory information, and in many cases long-lasting positive changes in well-being, meaning, and prosocial behaviour. The Gnostic invocation of Sophia is a specific technology for inducing a self-transcendent experience. It uses spoken word. The early Gnostic texts are emphatic about the importance of vocal invocation, of using the actual voice rather than silent intention, combined with somatic anchoring, the placement of hands on the heart, combined with specific conceptual framing. The recognition that the quality of consciousness being invoked already exists within the practitioner, obscured by his archonic conditioning rather than absent entirely. Each of these elements has a plausible neuroscientific account. Spoken word activates different neural pathways than silent thought. Somatic anchoring, touching the body with intention, activates interoceptive awareness, the brain's processing of internal bodily states, which is increasingly understood as a central mechanism in emotional regulation and self-awareness. Conceptual reframing, shifting from "I am trying to achieve something I lack" to "I am recognizing something already present," is the core mechanism of cognitive reappraisal, one of the most robustly studied emotion regulation strategies in the psychological literature. None of this proves that the Gnostic cosmology is factually accurate. The question of whether Archons literally exist, whether Sophia is a real cosmic being, whether the 13th Aeon is an actual location in some multi-dimensional space. These are questions that neuroscience and psychology cannot answer, and that this documentary is not claiming to resolve. What can be said is this: the practices derived from the Gnostic framework, assessed on their own terms as technologies for altering states of consciousness in specific directions, have components that are entirely explicable by contemporary science, and the directions they alter consciousness toward: self-transcendence, expanded awareness, reduced identification with ordinary ego-based processing, increased connection with something perceived as larger than personal identity, are directions that empirical research consistently associates with positive outcomes for well-being, meaning, and resilience. This is the foundation on which everything that follows is built. Not blind faith in a suppressed gospel. Not conspiratorial certainty about archonic control systems, a working hypothesis. These practices, derived from a serious and sophisticated ancient tradition, are worth engaging with seriously. Try them with the rigor you would bring to any experiment. Track your results. Be honest about what you find. Now, let us get into the actual practice. The Gnostic Friday the 13th practice, reconstructed from the Gospel of Mary, the Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Philip, and the supplementary materials in the Nag Hammadi texts, has 3 core elements and several auxiliary dimensions. The core elements are the gathering, the invocation, and the declaration. The auxiliary dimensions include specific working with the body, specific working with breath, and specific engagement with the concept of the lunar calendar as it applies to one's own life cycle. We will go through each of these in detail, with the level of specificity that actually allows implementation. Before addressing the gathering, which is the most socially complex element, and therefore the one with the most variables, it is worth establishing the baseline conditions for any of this work. The Gnostic texts are remarkably consistent on one point that modern practitioners often underestimate: the role of recognition. In the Gospel of Philip, there is a line that scholars have translated in several ways, but that consistently carries the sense of, you cannot receive what you have not already recognized within yourself. The Greek and Coptic terms here are about anagnorisis, recognition, the cognitive act of seeing what was always there. The Gnostic practice begins not with reaching for something external, but with a specific cognitive shift, the recognition that the quality of consciousness you are trying to cultivate is already present, latent, within your own awareness. This is not a platitude. It is an operational instruction. Before you begin the Friday the 13th practice, whether on the actual date or on any Friday the 13th that falls in the calendar year, or on any Friday that you choose to work with these principles, the preliminary step is what the texts call the awakening of recognition. You sit, you close your eyes, you allow your attention to settle, and then you ask yourself a specific question. What is the quality of awareness that is watching all of this? Not the thoughts, not the feelings, not the bodily sensations, the awareness itself, the space in which all of these things are arising and passing. You do not try to answer the question conceptually. You simply turn attention toward the question and allow it to rest there. Practitioners who have worked with this preliminary step consistently report that it creates a different quality of attention than ordinary focused concentration. Where concentration feels like effort, the narrowing of attention onto a specific object, this recognition turn feels more like release. The attention relaxes its ordinary grip on content and rests in a more open, spacious quality of awareness. In the vocabulary of contemplative neuroscience, this corresponds to a shift from what researchers call focused attention mode, in which the prefrontal cortex actively directs and sustains attention on a specific target, to what they call open monitoring mode, in which attention is present but not directed, receptive rather than selective. EEG studies of meditators in open monitoring states show specific patterns of gamma wave synchrony that are not present in ordinary waking consciousness or in focused attention states. The recognition turn is the foundation. From that foundation, you enter the three core practices. The gathering practice, as described in the Gospel of Mary, has a specific numerical component: 12 participants plus the invocation of the 13th consciousness. This has been interpreted in various ways by different communities of practice. The most literal reading is 12 people physically present, with the 13th seat empty, symbolically representing the monad, the divine consciousness that transcends all 12 archonic spheres, and the group's collective attention directed toward that empty seat throughout the practice. The more flexible reading, which has become increasingly prevalent in contemporary Gnostic and Neo-Gnostic communities, recognizes that the number 12 is the threshold, not the requirement. 11 people can practice with the intention of welcoming the 13th consciousness. 10 can. 8 can. What cannot happen, in the Gnostic framework, is a meaningful gathering of 13 without the 13th being understood as something categorically different from the other 12. The practical reason for the gathering is neurobiological, even if the texts express it cosmologically. When human beings gather with conscious intentionality, with a shared purpose, a shared orientation of attention, a shared commitment to what they are doing together, the social nervous system produces effects that are simply not available to the individual practitioner working alone. This is the core of what researchers like Jaak Panksepp have described through the seeking system, the brain's fundamental motivational architecture, and what Stephen Porges has described through polyvagal theory. The co-regulation of nervous systems in intentional community produces states of safety, openness, and receptivity that the individual nervous system cannot reliably generate alone. This is not a weakness. It is a feature of mammalian neurobiology. We are evolved to regulate together, and the Gnostic texts, whatever their cosmological claims, are describing a practice that takes full advantage of this basic biological reality. For those who cannot easily gather 12 others, and this is the reality for most people engaging with these practices in modern life, the texts do provide guidance. The Gospel of Philip contains a passage often translated as, "Even the one who prays alone in the inner room is not alone, if they understand what the room contains." The inner room in this context is the space of one's own consciousness, and the what it contains refers to what Philip elsewhere calls the bridal chamber, the state in which the individual soul is in full resonance with its own divine origin. The solo practice, in other words, is entirely viable. It simply requires greater intentional cultivation of what the gathering would provide organically. For the solo practitioner, the gathering element of the Friday the 13th practice works like this. You create a physical space that is dedicated to this practice, not permanently, just for the duration of the practice. Clean the space. Do this physically, not symbolically. The act of cleaning a physical space before intentional practice has documented psychological effects. It signals to the nervous system that what follows is different from ordinary activity, reduces background cognitive noise created by environmental disorder. Research by Kathleen Vose at the University of Minnesota has shown that visual disorder in the environment increases cognitive load and creates a proprioceptive experience of preparation that primes the practitioner for focused attention. Place something at the center of the space that represents for you the quality of consciousness you are oriented toward. This can be as simple as a candle. The object is not the point. The act of placing it is the point. The deliberate creation of a spatial center, a focus for the group's or the individual's attention. If you are gathering with others, the arrangement of the group in relation to this center matters. The Pistis Sophia describes gatherings in which participants stood in a circle facing the center, with their hands open and their hearts directed toward the light. The circle arrangement is not merely symbolic. Research on group dynamics, specifically on what Ari Kruglansky at the University of Maryland has called group centrality, shows that circular seating arrangements produce more equal participation, more shared focus, and greater group cohesion than linear or hierarchical arrangements. The Gnostic gathering was designed both cosmologically and practically to have no head, no authority figure. The only center was the 13th consciousness, the monad presence, and every participant was equidistant from that center. The duration of the gathering element of the practice is approximately 20 minutes. The texts do not specify clock time. That would be anachronistic. But they describe the gathering as lasting until the recognition settles into stillness, which experienced practitioners interpret as the period required for the group's collective nervous system to co-regulate into a shared state of open attention. In individual practice, 20 minutes of the preliminary recognition turn and spatial preparation tends to achieve the same functional state. The invocation practice is the central element, and it is where the Friday specificity, the Sophia dimension, becomes most directly operative. The invocation, as described in the Gospel of Mary and elaborated in the Pistis Sophia, is a spoken practice. Both hands are placed on the heart, not one hand, both. The texts are specific about this, and there is a physiological reason. Placing both hands on the chest, particularly when combined with slightly increased pressure, activates mechanoreceptors in the chest that feed signals to the vagus nerve, contributing to what Porges and others have described as the ventral vagal state, the physiological substrate of felt safety, social engagement, and open awareness. This is the same mechanism that makes physical embrace calming. The Gnostic practitioners did not know about vagal tone, but they had discovered, through generations of experimentation with human embodiment, that this posture consistently preceded and facilitated the states of consciousness they were trying to access. With both hands on the heart, the invocation is spoken aloud. The specific words are less important than the specific qualities the words need to carry. The Gospel of Mary describes the invocation as containing 3 recognitions: recognition of the sacred time, your day is here; recognition of the sacred number, your number has arrived; and recognition of the inversion, I see what was made feared as sacred. These 3 recognitions are then followed by what the text calls the call, the direct address to Sophia, the explicit invitation for her quality of consciousness to activate within the practitioner's own awareness. What this looks like in practice. With both hands on the heart, with the space prepared, with the preliminary recognition turn completed, you speak these words, or words in this spirit, aloud and slowly, with the full weight of your attention on each phrase. Sophia, wisdom of the deep, this is the day of your resonance. The 6th day, your day, is here. The 13th moment has arrived. I recognize in what was made fear the presence of what is sacred. I do not avoid this. I move toward it, and I call your quality of consciousness, wisdom, self-knowledge, the awareness that knows itself as divine, into full waking in my own awareness, not as something foreign, as the recognition of what I already am. Pause after speaking this. The pause is part of the practice. The texts describe a period of listening that follows invocation, listening not for an external voice, but for the quality of response in one's own awareness. What changes? What subtly shifts in the texture of consciousness after speaking these words aloud with full attention? The Gnostic practitioners believed, and modern practitioners with experience in this work consistently report, that there is something to notice here, a quality that is different from ordinary waking consciousness, a sense of spaciousness, or of depth, or of what many describe simply as more than the ordinary quality of awareness, without being more in any particular content direction. This quality, whatever we call it, Sophia's presence in the Gnostic framework, the ventral vagal state in the neurobiological framework, open monitoring plus self-transcendent experience in the psychological research framework, is what the practice is building toward. And the Friday the 13th combination, in the Gnostic understanding, represents the calendrical moment at which this quality is most readily accessed. Not because of planetary magic in the naive sense, but because the accumulated cultural weight of fear and avoidance surrounding this date creates, paradoxically, a specific kind of opportunity. When you consciously choose to move towards something you've been conditioned to avoid, when you replace fear with curiosity, avoidance with investigation, superstition with practice, you're doing something quite specific in cognitive and psychological terms. You're engaging what researchers call approach motivation, in a domain where avoidance motivation has been the default. An approach motivation in any domain, when consciously chosen rather than reactive, produces a shift in neural processing that is associated with greater openness, greater creativity, and greater access to what the psychological literature calls positive affect. Not mere happiness, but the broader quality of energetic engagement with experience that underlies productive learning and development. The Liberation Declaration is the third core element, and it completes the arc of the practice. If the invocation is a call, as a turn towards Sophia, the declaration is a claim. It is the practitioner's assertion, in their own voice, of what they now recognize to be true, spoken against the background of what they have been conditioned to believe. The Gospel of Mary frames the declaration as the most important element of the three for a specific reason. What is spoken aloud creates what cannot be unspoken. What is declared in the voice that carries breath becomes part of the living record of understanding. This is, in the Gnostic framework, a claim about the relationship between spoken language and what they called the pneuma, the breath spirit that animates human beings and connects them to the divine. Speaking truth aloud for the Gnostic tradition was not mere verbal behaviour, it was a participatory act in the process of reality itself. Modern linguistic philosophy, from J.L. Austin's work on performative utterances to more recent research on the psychological effects of self-affirmation, has arrived at a less cosmic but functionally similar conclusion. When we speak something aloud, particularly when we speak it with attention, sincerity, and in the context of a prepared intentional state, we are doing something quite different from thinking it silently. The neural correlates of spoken and internal language are substantially different. Vocal production involves motor planning, breath regulation, proprioceptive feedback from the speech organs, and auditory self-monitoring, all of which engage neural systems that silent thought does not. This broader neural engagement means that spoken declarations, all else being equal, have a greater impact on memory consolidation, emotional processing, and what researchers call schema revision, the updating of deep conceptual frameworks, than equivalent silent thoughts. The declaration in the Friday the 13th practice is this: a statement, in your own words but with specific content, of three things. First, that you now recognise Friday the 13th as sacred rather than feared. Second, that you understand the historical reasons for the inversion, the specific campaigns that transformed this knowledge. Third, that you commit to carrying this recognition forward actively in how you relate to time, to the feminine principle, and to the concept of liberation from deterministic patterns of thought and behaviour. The third element is the most practically consequential, because it is the one that connects the specific Friday the 13th practice to the ongoing project of what the texts call awakening, the progressive clarification of consciousness from archonic conditioning. This is where the practice meets daily life, and where most people who engage with Gnostic-derived spirituality either lose interest or find their deepest engagement. The cosmological framework, the 12 spheres, the 13 aeons, Sophia's journey, monad consciousness, is intellectually fascinating. But it is also, for most modern people, quite remote from the texture of daily experience. What does it actually mean to liberate consciousness from archonic control on a Tuesday morning when you're stuck in traffic, or overwhelmed by a deadline, or in conflict with a person you love? The answer the Gnostic texts give to this question is specific and practical, and it is the answer that the remainder of this documentary will elaborate in detail. The archonic control that the texts are primarily concerned with is not, in the framework we are developing here, a literal set of cosmic beings running a matrix-style simulation of reality. The archonic principle, the principle of deterministic material conditioning, is what we would recognise today as the totality of our unconscious patterning. The habitual responses, the conditioned beliefs, the automatic emotional reactions, the ingrained ways of relating to ourselves and others that were laid down by our developmental experiences and that operate largely without our awareness or choice. When the Gnostic texts say that the human being is trapped within the 12 archonic spheres, they're saying, in the mythological language available to them, that human consciousness, in its ordinary state, is captured by its own conditioning. It is not free. It is reactive rather than responsive. It is mechanical rather than aware. The liberation that the texts point toward is not escape from the body, not ascent to some other dimension of reality, not any kind of external salvation. It is the clarification of awareness itself, the progressive discovery that beneath the conditioned reactive mind, beneath the archonic 12-fold structure of habit and pattern and automatic response, there is a quality of consciousness that is not conditioned, not reactive, not mechanical. That quality, which the texts call monad consciousness or divine Sophia, is what the Friday the 13th practice is designed to access. And having accessed it, the long-term work is the integration of that access into ordinary life, learning to operate from that quality of awareness even when the conditioned mind is activated, even when the archonic patterns are running, even when the 12-sphere structure of habitual reactivity is doing what it always does. This is the work of what we might call spiritual maturity, and it is the work that the 30-day practice framework outlined later in this documentary is designed to support. But before going there, it is worth spending substantial time on the scientific and philosophical framework, because that framework provides the conceptual scaffolding that makes the practice intelligible in contemporary terms. And intelligibility, for the kind of practitioners this documentary is designed for, is not optional. It is the difference between engaged, rigorous practice and credulous hit-or-miss dabbling. The Gnostic cosmological system, stripped of its mythological elaboration, rests on a foundational philosophical claim that is entirely defensible in contemporary terms. Consciousness is primary, not in the metaphysical idealist sense of claiming that the physical world does not exist, but in the epistemological sense of recognizing that every experience of reality, every perception, every thought, every emotion, every sense of self, is an event in consciousness. We never experience the world directly. we experience our experience of the world, and our experience of the world is massively shaped by the structures, the conditioning, the patterning, the archonic spheres through which consciousness filters and interprets raw experience. This claim is not controversial in contemporary cognitive science. It is in fact the foundational premise of the predictive processing framework that has come to dominate computational neuroscience over the last 2 decades, associated with researchers like Carl Friston at University College London and Andy Clark at the University of Edinburgh. On this model, the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It does not passively receive sensory information from the world and then process it. It actively generates predictions based on prior experience, on learned models, on deeply ingrained expectations, and then uses incoming sensory data primarily to correct those predictions when they are significantly wrong. What we experience as perception is, in this framework, primarily the brain's best current model of what is out there, updated at the margins by actual sensory input. This has profound consequences for understanding what the Gnostics were pointing at. The 12 archonic spheres of conditioning are, in predictive processing terms, the deeply ingrained generative models that the brain uses to construct experience. They are not external realities, they are internal architectures, and because they are internal architectures, they can, in principle, be changed. The question is how? The predictive processing framework suggests that the conditions under which these deeply ingrained models are most susceptible to revision are states of high attention combined with low prediction error. The brain is attentive but not overwhelmed by unexpected information. States of elevated uncertainty in which the old predictions have clearly failed. The model is clearly wrong, making the brain more receptive to new models. And states in which what neuroscientists call precision weighting, shifts, in which the brain assigns more reliability to current sensory input and less reliability to prior predictions. Contemplative practices, including the Gnostic practices we're examining, appear to create all 3 of these conditions. They produce states of high attentiveness. They deliberately create a kind of productive uncertainty, by asking questions, by holding paradoxes, by orienting toward what cannot be conceptually grasped, that puts the ordinary predictive models in question, and they use somatic anchoring, breath work, vocal practices, and environmental design to shift the balance of attention toward present moment sensory experience and away from the narrative overlays that the conditioned mind continuously generates. The Sophia invocation in these terms is a specific technology for creating a moment in which the brain's deeply ingrained predictive models, its archonic conditioning, are temporarily suspended, and the raw quality of awareness, prior to its filtration through those models, becomes more directly available. This is not a full explanation of what happens in contemplative practice, because the predictive processing framework, rich as it is, does not fully account for the self-transcendent quality that practitioners consistently report, but it gives us a rigorous starting point for understanding why these practices produce real effects, and why the conditions created by the Friday the 13th combination, the deliberate approach toward what has been feared, the communal gathering, the spoken invocation and declaration, are conditions particularly well suited to the kind of model revision the practice is aimed at. Let us now be very specific about the practice itself. What follows is a step-by-step account of the complete Friday the 13th practice, from preparation through integration, with enough detail that someone who has never encountered Gnostic practice can implement it from scratch. This account draws on the texts themselves, on the work of contemporary scholars who have engaged seriously with Gnostic practice traditions, and on the reported experiences of practitioners working in communities across Europe, North America, and the Middle East. Preparation begins several days before the actual Friday the 13th. 3 days, ideally. This is not magical thinking. It is practical. The preliminary work is cognitive and attitudinal, and cognitive and attitudinal shifts require time. In the 3 days before the practice, the work is simple. Each morning, when you first wake, spend 5 minutes with the following reflection. Think of one area of your life in which you're operating from habitual unconscious patterning. One area in which your responses feel mechanical, reactive, or like they belong to a version of yourself that you have outgrown. Do not try to change this area. Simply observe it with full honesty. Write down what you observe, in whatever form works for you. The act of writing is important. It engages the prefrontal cortex in explicit processing of material that is often kept in the implicit automatic processing systems. This begins the process of bringing the archonic conditioning into conscious awareness, which is a necessary precondition for any genuine revision of it. Also, in the 3 days before, begin noticing your relationship to Friday itself. Do you have a residual superstition about Friday the 13th, however rational you consider yourself? Do you feel any trace of avoidance, any micro-anxiety, any impulse to dismiss or mock the date? Notice this without judgment. The noticing is the first step. The Gnostic texts describe this noticing as the beginning of what they call waking up from the hypnosis, the recognition that a conditioned pattern is operating, which is already, in some sense, a move beyond it. On the day itself, the practice structure is as follows. Morning, upon waking, the recognition turn. Before speaking to anyone, before engaging with a screen, before anything, sit for 10 minutes in the preliminary recognition turn described earlier. Turn attention toward the quality of awareness that is watching all arising experience. Rest there without trying to hold it or grasp it. Then speak, aloud, even if just above a whisper, the simple statement, "I recognize this day as sacred. I am moving toward what was made feared." The physical dimension of the morning practice. If possible, spend some time outside in the morning light. This is not spiritually specific. Morning light exposure regulates circadian rhythms, suppresses nocturnal melatonin production, and initiates the daily serotonin cascade that underlies mood regulation and cognitive function. It also provides something that the Gnostic texts describe as important for this specific day: the experience of the liminal moment, the threshold between darkness and light. The Pistis Sophia has an extended passage about what it calls the threshold practices done in the moments of transition between states, between sleep and waking, between night and day, between one season and another. These threshold moments, the texts claim, are moments of particular permeability, moments when the habitual patterning is slightly less fixed, because the state that sustained it is in transition. Morning light exposure takes advantage of this threshold quality. Midday practice, the gathering or the solo equivalent. If you have managed to organize a gathering of 12, and this is worth the effort, because the communal element genuinely changes the quality of what is available, the midday period is the optimal time. The practical reason is again both cosmological and physiological. In the Gnostic planetary scheme, midday corresponds to the sun's peak, which in this cosmological framework represents the peak of the higher light's penetration into the material world. But there's also a cortisol rhythm argument. Cortisol, the stress hormone, peaks in the morning and declines through the day. By midday, most people's baseline stress response has begun to settle, making them more accessible to the kind of open, receptive attention that the practice requires. For the gathering, the practical structure is this: circle arrangement, facing the center. The center holds whatever symbolic object has been chosen to represent the 13th consciousness. 15 minutes of shared silence. Not meditation in any specific style, simply sitting together in silence with attention directed toward the center. Then one person reads aloud from a Gnostic text. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the beginning sections of the Pistis Sophia, the opening of the Gospel of Thomas, not interpretation, just the words. Then another 15 minutes of silence. Then the invocation, spoken by one person on behalf of the group with all hands on hearts. Then the declaration, spoken by each person individually, in their own words, carrying the three elements described above. The total duration is approximately 1 hour. Do not rush any portion of it. The texts are consistent that speed is the enemy of depth in these practices. The archonic conditioning is fast. It runs automatically in milliseconds. The quality of consciousness being cultivated is not slow, exactly, but it requires a pace different from ordinary reactive speed. The practitioner needs to become comfortable with a quality of time that is more spacious than efficient. For the solo practitioner, the midday practice is the same in structure but conducted alone. The circle arrangement is replaced by simply sitting at the center of your prepared space, facing your symbolic object. The shared silence is replaced by solo silence, which requires more discipline, since there is no social co-regulation to help sustain it, but which is entirely achievable. The solo declaration is spoken to the space itself, with the full understanding that the space has been prepared to hold this work. The evening practice, which completes the day, is the most personal of the three. It is what the texts call the sealing, the integration of whatever has arisen during the day's work into the practitioner's ongoing consciousness. The evening practice is simple. Sit again in the recognition turn. Review the day, not with analysis, not with judgment, but with the quality of open awareness that has been cultivated throughout the day. What has shifted? What has been recognized that was not recognized before? What area of archonic conditioning has become slightly more transparent? Write down your observations. This writing is not journaling in the therapeutic sense. It is documentation. You are creating a record of your own practice trajectory, which will become useful as reference material over the weeks and months of working with these methods. End the day with a declaration of the sacred, not the full declaration of the morning, but a brief spoken acknowledgement. I close this day having moved toward what was made feared. I carry the recognition forward. These are not magic words. They are what the cognitive scientist would call an implementation intention, a specific verbal commitment to a future behavioral or attitudinal direction, which research by Peter Gollwitzer at New York University shows substantially increases the likelihood of follow-through on intentions in the days following the commitment. Now, beyond the Friday the 13th practice itself, which occurs on specific dates, there are typically 1 or 2 Friday the 13ths per calendar year, sometimes 3. There is the broader question of the ongoing practice between those dates. Because the Gnostic texts are clear that the Friday the 13th combination is a particularly potent moment, but they are equally clear that the work of liberation from archonic conditioning is continuous. The specific date is an accelerator, not the entire engine. The ongoing practice framework that the texts describe has 3 dimensions, which map cleanly onto 3 temporal scales. The daily dimension is the simplest and the most important. Every morning the recognition turn, 10 minutes of turning attention toward the quality of awareness that underlies all experience. This is the foundation on which everything else is built. Without this daily grounding, the periodic practices have much less traction. With it, each periodic practice becomes a deepening of something that is continuously cultivated. Every Friday, not just the 13th, but every Friday, the practice deepens slightly. On ordinary Fridays, the Gnostic tradition recommends what might be called Sophia Day orientation, a deliberate increase in attention to the qualities associated with the divine feminine principle, not in any gender essentialist way, but in the sense of the philosophical qualities that tradition associates with the feminine: receptivity, relational awareness, embodied wisdom, the kind of knowledge that comes from deep listening rather than active analysis. On Fridays, this means slowing down the analytical, goal-directed mode of consciousness that dominates most of the work week and spending some additional time in receptive mode. Listening to music that opens rather than stimulates, spending time in nature, engaging in conversations that prioritize depth over efficiency, doing something with your hands that does not have a predetermined output. The monthly dimension tracks the lunar cycle. The 13-month lunar calendar that the Gnostic tradition valued was not primarily a timekeeping system. It was a system for maintaining awareness of a particular rhythm of reality, the rhythm of the moon, which has its own relationship to tides, to sleep, to emotional cycles, and, for those who menstruate, to the biological cycle of fertility and regeneration. Regardless of whether you menstruate, tracking the lunar cycle with some intentionality creates a different relationship to time than the purely solar calendar allows. The new moon, the moment of darkness and beginning, becomes a monthly moment of recommitment to the practice. The full moon, the moment of maximum lunar light, becomes a monthly moment of review. What has become more visible in my consciousness over this lunar cycle? What conditioning has become more transparent? What quality of the deeper awareness has become more accessible? The yearly dimension is the Friday the 13th practice itself, taken in the larger context of a year of work. If you've been practicing the daily and weekly dimensions consistently, the Friday the 13th practice at the end of a year of that work will be qualitatively different from the Friday the 13th practice of a beginner. Not because the date changes, but because you change. The practice in year 3 is not the same as the practice in year 1, because year 1 through 3 represents a genuine transformation in the practitioner's relationship to their own conditioning, their own awareness, and the quality of consciousness the text calls Sophia. This brings us to the testimonial dimension, the experiences of practitioners who have worked with these methods across multiple years and who have, to varying degrees, documented their trajectories. It is important to be clear about what this kind of evidence can and cannot show. Testimonials are not controlled experiments. They cannot demonstrate causation. They are subject to confirmation bias, expectation effects, and motivated reporting. Having said all of that, they are not nothing. When a large number of practitioners, working in different contexts and different cultural backgrounds, report similar specific experiences from similar specific practices, this convergent evidence is meaningful, not as proof, but as plausible signal worth taking seriously. Practitioners who have worked with the Friday the 13th framework for 3 or more years and who have been willing to document their experience publicly through academic presentations, through interviews in scholarly contexts, or through careful written accounts, tend to describe a characteristic arc. In the first year, the dominant experience is what many describe as seeing the machinery. The recognition turn, the invocations, the declarations, these begin to make the practitioner's own conditioning more visible. They begin to see, with increasing clarity, where they are running on autopilot, where their responses to life are mechanical rather than chosen, where the archonic 12-sphere structure of their habitual patterning is operating. This is often uncomfortable. It is rarely dramatic. But it is consistently reported as the first identifiable shift that practitioners can point to as a consequence of the practice. In the second year, the characteristic experience is what practitioners describe as glimpses, moments, sometimes during practice, sometimes entirely unexpectedly in ordinary life, in which the ordinary sense of being a separate self, bounded by skin and conditioned by history, briefly relaxes. Moments of what David Yaden's research calls self-transcendence, in which the practitioner has a direct experiential sense of being something larger than their personal history, something that is not defined by the 12-sphere structure of their conditioning. These moments are typically brief. They are not hallucinatory. They are not dissociative. They are more like remembering something that was always known, which is precisely how the Gospel of Mary describes them, as anagnorisis, as recognition, not as new information. In the third year and beyond, practitioners report something that is harder to describe briefly, but that most of them point to as the most significant transformation: a shift in baseline. The quality of awareness that is touched in the glimpses of Year 2 begins to be available more continuously, not as a peak experience, not as a mystical state, but as the background texture of ordinary experience. The archonic conditioning, the reactive patterns, the habitual patterning, does not disappear, but the practitioner's relationship to it changes. It is seen more clearly. It has less grip. There is more space between stimulus and response, which is, in the words of Viktor Frankl, one of the most fundamental markers of human freedom. One practitioner, a historian of religion at a university in the Netherlands, who has worked with Gnostic practices for 11 years and who requested partial anonymity for professional reasons, described the trajectory this way. In the beginning, I was very excited about the cosmology, the Archons, Sophia, the whole mythological structure. I thought I was learning facts about reality. After several years, I understood that I was learning a language, a very precise and carefully designed language for describing an interior landscape that is real, but that is not literally populated by supernatural beings. The Archons are real. They are my own patterns of conditioned response. Sophia is real. She is the quality of awareness in me that is not those patterns. Friday the 13th as a sacred day that becomes real when you work with it, because you are doing something genuinely countercultural, genuinely subversive of the superstitious conditioning, and that countercultural act has real psychological and experiential consequences. A practitioner in the contemplative Christian tradition, someone who came to Gnostic studies through Thomas Merton's engagement with Sophia theology, and who has integrated these practices with a broadly Christian framework, describes the 3-year arc differently, but arrives at a similar destination. The first thing that happened was that I became less afraid, not of Friday the 13th specifically. I'd never been particularly superstitious, but of my own inner life. I became less afraid of the darkness in myself, less afraid of the parts of my experience that I had been conditioned to avoid. The Sophia invocation, repeated over many months, seemed to create a kind of trust, not in anything external, but in the quality of awareness itself, in its capacity to hold whatever arises without being destroyed by it. That is what I would call the liberation the texts are pointing at, not escape, capacity. A practitioner with a background in contemporary cognitive science, who came to these practices through the research on self-transcendent experience, and who has maintained a rigorous practice log for 6 years, reports results that are specifically measurable. I track several things: sleep quality, emotional reactivity to stressors, the frequency of what I would call reactive episodes, moments where I respond to something from pure conditioning rather than from considered awareness, and what I can only describe as the quality of my own attention on a given day. Over 6 years, the trend lines on all of these metrics are positive. Not dramatically, not overnight, but consistently. The Friday the 13th practices show up as notable points in my log. The day after a well-executed Friday the 13th practice tends to have measurably different markers than the surrounding days. I cannot claim that proves anything, but it is consistent enough that I take it seriously. These accounts, different as they are in vocabulary and framework, converge on several shared characteristics. The initial experience is increased visibility of one's own conditioning. The intermediate experience is access to qualitatively different modes of consciousness. The long-term experience is a shift in baseline, in what might be called the ground floor of one's psychological state, towards something more spacious, more resilient, and more capable of genuine response rather than automatic reaction. and the Friday the 13th practices serve across all of these accounts as a specific kind of anchor point in the larger practice trajectory, a moment of deeper intentionality that crystallizes and accelerates the work happening in the daily and weekly practices. The 30-day practice roadmap that follows is designed for someone who is beginning this work without prior background. It assumes that the person has read this far and has some understanding of the framework. It does not assume any prior meditation experience, any prior Gnostic knowledge, or any particular worldview. It asks only for sincere engagement and honest observation of results. Days 1 through 7 are about establishing the foundation. The only practice is the recognition turn, 10 minutes each morning, turning attention toward the quality of awareness that underlies all experience. Do not add anything else. Do not try to make something happen. Simply practice the turning of attention and the resting there. Keep a brief daily record of what you notice, not interpretations, not judgments, just observations. Attention kept moving to thoughts about work. There was a quality of spaciousness for about 30 seconds before the phone buzzed. Hard to stay still, restlessness. These observations are the data of your own practice, and they are the most important data you will generate. Days 8 through 14 add the Friday element. If a Friday falls in this period, on that Friday extend the morning recognition turn to 20 minutes and add the Sophia invocation. If no Friday falls in this period, work with the Friday orientation every day. The deliberate shift toward receptive, relational, listening mode consciousness. Notice what this does. Notice what opens in you when you're not in efficient analytical mode. Notice what is available when you're not trying to accomplish something. Write it down. Days 15 through 21 introduce the declaration practice. Each morning, after the recognition turn, speak aloud 3 things. 1 observation about your own conditioning from the past week, 1 quality of the deeper awareness you have touched in the recognition turn, and 1 commitment to carry that quality into the day's activities. The specificity is important. Not, I commit to being more aware. That is too vague to be an implementation intention. Something like, I commit to pausing 3 seconds before responding when my colleague does the thing that usually makes me react. Or, I commit to noticing when I am in avoidance mode and simply naming it to myself in the moment. Specific, behavioral, measurable. Days 22 through 30 integrate the lunar dimension and deepen the overall practice. In this final week, begin tracking where you are in the lunar cycle. Find out when the nearest new moon is and when the nearest full moon is. On the new moon day, do a longer practice, 30 to 40 minutes, that combines all 3 elements: recognition turn, invocation, and declaration. This is your monthly practice commitment. On the full moon day, do a review practice, again 30 to 40 minutes, in which the recognition turn is preceded by a deliberate review of what has shifted, opened, or become more visible over the lunar cycle. By the end of 30 days, you will have established a daily practice, a weekly deepening, a monthly anchor, and enough data from your own observation to evaluate whether this framework is producing results worth continuing with. The honest assessment of your own results, not what you hoped would happen, not what the tradition promises will happen, but what is actually happening in your specific experience, is the most important piece of information you can generate from this first month. The most common obstacles encountered in working with this practice, and they're worth addressing directly because forewarned is forearmed. The first and most common obstacle is what practitioners call archonic impatience, the conditioned mind's tendency to demand quick, dramatic results. The Gnostic texts are entirely realistic about this. The liberation from conditioning is not an event, it is a process. The Gospel of Philip says explicitly that those who expect to pass through in a single moment do not understand what they are moving through. The work unfolds over years, not days. The first month is about establishing the foundation. The first year is about learning to see the machinery. The second year is about glimpsing what lies beneath the machinery. The third year and beyond is about gradually, non-linearly, inconsistently, but directionally moving toward the quality of baseline awareness that the texts call liberation. Anyone who tells you this work produces dramatic enlightenment in 30 days is either mistaken or misleading you. What 30 days of sincere practice can produce is this: the beginning of a relationship with your own awareness that is more conscious, more deliberate, and more honest than it was before. That is genuinely not nothing. The second common obstacle is what might be called the mythology problem. Practitioners who encounter the Gnostic cosmological framework for the first time sometimes become either too literal, treating the Archons as real entities in a science fiction sense, expecting to perceive them directly, approaching the practice like a video game of spiritual combat, or too dismissive, deciding that since the mythology is obviously not literally true, the practices derived from it can't be worth taking seriously. Both of these are mistakes. The mythology is a map. It is an extraordinarily sophisticated and carefully calibrated map of interior psychological and spiritual territory, developed by brilliant people over centuries of careful observation and practice. Like all maps, it is not the territory it represents. The Archons are not literally beings with winged forms and thrones in celestial spheres. They are the principle of conditioning as it manifests in specific domains of human experience. Sophia is not literally a goddess who fell and needs to be rescued. She is the quality of wisdom that is latent in human consciousness and that the practice is designed to clarify. Working with the mythology means neither swallowing it wholesale nor rejecting it out of hand. It means holding it as a working metaphor, a consistently useful framework for organizing observations about interior experience, and allowing your own experience to gradually fill in and correct it. The third common obstacle is the difficulty of sustaining practice without community. This is perhaps the most practically significant obstacle for most people engaging with this material, because most people will not have access to 12 others who are willing to practice the Gnostic, Friday the 13th material together. The solo practice is entirely valid and can produce genuine results, but it is harder. The nervous system's need for social co-regulation does not disappear, simply because the practice asks us to work alone. Finding community, even imperfect, geographically distant, digitally connected community, of people who are working with similar material makes a measurable difference to practice sustainability. There are now a number of serious communities working with Gnostic-derived practices in ways that are rigorous, historically informed, and practically oriented. The Gnostic Retreat Centre, which has operated in France since 1998 and has a substantial English-language online community, offers structured practice programs based on the Nag Hammadi texts. The Lectorium Rosicrucianum, with chapters in more than 40 countries, works with a contemporary Gnostic framework that draws heavily on the same source texts. The Sophian Gnostic tradition, associated with teachers like Tau Maliki and working within a specifically Christian Gnostic framework, offers detailed practice guidance and a genuine community of practitioners. None of these communities should be entered uncritically. As with any spiritual community, the questions to ask are: is there genuine transparency about authority and decision-making? Are practitioners encouraged to exercise their own judgment and report their own results honestly? Is intellectual engagement valued as much as devotional engagement? Is doubt welcomed as a sign of seriousness rather than treated as a sign of insufficient faith? Communities that answer these questions well are worth engaging with. Communities that answer them poorly are worth approaching with appropriate caution. The fourth common obstacle, and this one is particularly relevant for the specific audience this documentary is aimed at, people who have been burned by manipulative spiritual content and who are therefore appropriately skeptical of anything that sounds too polished or too certain, is the cynicism that can make genuine engagement impossible. There's a difference between healthy skepticism, which tests claims against experience and adjusts beliefs accordingly, and defensive cynicism, which refuses to test anything because every spiritual claim has been dismissed in advance. Healthy skepticism is what this practice requires and what it is designed to reward. Defensive cynicism is itself an archonic pattern, a conditioned protective response that has calcified into an obstacle. If you find yourself unable to engage with any of this material without an inner voice immediately identifying it as nonsense, manipulation, or wishful thinking, it is worth asking, whose voice is that? Is that your own considered judgment after genuine investigation? Or is it a conditioned response that predates any actual encounter with this specific material? This is not a pitch for credulity. It is an invitation to notice the conditioned mind in action, which is, after all, exactly what the practice is designed to produce. Let us now move into the more advanced dimensions of the practice, the territory that becomes available after sustained engagement with the foundational work. After a year of consistent daily practice, practitioners typically begin to encounter what the Gnostic texts describe as the second veil, a layer of conditioning that is deeper and subtler than the reactive patterns addressed in the first year. Where the first year work makes visible the obvious mechanical responses, the habitual anger, the chronic anxiety, the patterns of avoidance or compulsion that everyone can recognize as not quite themselves, the second year's work begins to reveal something more fundamental, the structures of identity itself, the deeply held narratives about who we are, what we need, what we deserve, what is possible for us. The beliefs about reality that are so ingrained they don't feel like beliefs, they feel like facts. The Gnostic term for this layer of conditioning is interesting. It is called the character, not in the modern sense of personality, but in the older Greek sense of a stamp or impression. The Archons in the Gnostic mythology impress their character on the soul as it descends through the 12 spheres on its way into incarnation. Each sphere leaves its mark, a specific quality of limitation, a specific narrow channel through which the soul will tend to experience reality. These impressions are not the soul itself, they are what the soul has been marked with, and the advanced practice is the systematic process of distinguishing the soul, the quality of pure awareness, from all the marks that have been impressed upon it. This is sophisticated psychological territory, and it maps onto what contemporary depth psychology would recognize as the work of the personal unconscious in Jungian terms, or what contemporary trauma-informed therapy would call the implicit memory system. The stored experiential templates that shape present perception without being consciously remembered or activated. The difference between the Gnostic approach and most contemporary psychological approaches is not in what they identify as the territory. Both are pointing at the same landscape of deep conditioning, but in what they identify as the resource. Conventional psychology works primarily with the personal history, understanding where the patterns came from, working through the emotional charge associated with their origins, developing new behavioral responses. The Gnostic practice works with awareness itself, the quality of consciousness that is prior to all conditioned patterns that cannot be explained by personal history because it predates personal history, and that when clarified provides a resource for engagement with life that is not dependent on having resolved every historical wound. Both approaches are valuable, they are not mutually exclusive, and the most sophisticated practitioners work with both. But the Gnostic contribution, the identification of a quality of awareness that is prior to and distinct from personal history, is a genuinely distinctive and extraordinarily valuable contribution that contemporary psychology, with its relative neglect of contemplative dimensions of human experience, is only now beginning to incorporate. The advanced Friday the 13th practice that becomes available in year 2 and beyond has several additional elements not present in the foundational practice. The first is what the texts call the deep invocation, an extended version of the Sophia invocation that includes explicit engagement with the specific domains of conditioning that have become visible in the practitioner's first-year work. This is deeply personal. The deep invocation begins with the standard elements: hands on heart, recognition of the sacred time, the call to Sophia, but then extends into a specific engagement with the particular archonic impressions that the practitioner has identified as most operative in their own experience. I call your wisdom to illuminate the place where I confuse fear with discernment. I call your presence to the pattern in me that mistakes reactivity for strength. I call the quality of knowing that does not depend on certainty into the space where I habitually demand certainty before I can move. The deep invocation is co-created between the practitioner and the practice. It cannot be scripted in advance, because it is responsive to what the actual ongoing practice has revealed. This is why it belongs in the advanced section rather than the foundational section. You cannot do the deep invocation authentically before you have spent enough time with the foundational practice to know what specifically needs illuminating. The foundational practice creates the self-knowledge that the advanced practice then works with. The second advanced element is the integration of what the Pistis Sophia calls the repentance hymns. Not repentance in the Christian sense of remorse for sin, but in the original Greek meaning of metanoia, a change of mind or a turning of consciousness. The 13 repentance hymns in the Pistis Sophia are Sophia's own words as she moves through the process of recognizing her own descent into the material world and orienting herself back toward the pleroma. They are extraordinary texts, poetic, specific, emotionally complex, and working with them as part of the Friday the 13th practice in year 2 and beyond significantly deepens the practice's emotional and psychological reach. The third advanced element is what practitioners working within various Gnostic traditions call the reversal practice, the systematic work of taking each of the 13 identified archonic conditioning patterns, naming them clearly, and then deliberately orienting toward their opposite quality. This is not positive thinking in the superficial sense. It is much more rigorous. The reversal practice asks the practitioner to first identify, with complete honesty, the specific archonic pattern, the specific quality of conditioned limitation, in as much detail as possible. What triggers it? How does it feel in the body? What is the narrative it tells? What does it protect against? Only when this understanding is genuinely deep, not intellectual but experiential, felt rather than theorized, does the practice move toward the reversal. And the reversal is not simply the opposite behavior. It is the quality of consciousness that is prior to the archonic pattern and from which a different range of responses becomes available. Fear-based caution, for example, does not have courage as its reversal in the Gnostic framework. It has the quality of awareness that can see both the legitimate signal in the fear and the archonic distortion of that signal and respond from that fuller seeing. This is genuinely advanced work, and it is work that most practitioners find cannot be sustained alone. The community dimension, the gathering of 12 in whatever form is accessible, becomes increasingly important as the practice deepens, because the depth of self-knowledge required for the reversal practice exceeds what most individuals can sustain with only their own awareness as a resource. Other practitioners, working in the same framework, provide perspective, challenge, and the particular quality of support that the Gnostic tradition calls koinonia, fellowship in truth, the shared orientation toward the same quality of consciousness. In terms of long-term trajectory, what happens after years of this work? The practitioners who have been at it longest describe something that is almost impossible to communicate to those who have not experienced it. And that sounds either incredible or boring depending on your orientation. The long-term result is not extraordinary experiences, it is ordinary experience lived more fully. The texture of daily life, a conversation, a meal, a moment of beauty, a moment of difficulty, becomes richer, more present, more fully felt, because the practitioner's attention is less consistently hijacked by the archonic patterns of reactive conditioning and more consistently available to what is actually happening. This is not a dramatic result. It is the most profound result possible, because it is the result that every human being is, at the deepest level, seeking to be here fully in their own life. The Friday the 13th practice, in the fullness of its development, from the foundational work of the recognition turn, the gathering, the invocation and declaration, through the monthly and yearly anchors of the lunar cycle and the specific sacred date, is a technology for producing that result. It is a carefully designed, historically tested, philosophically coherent, neurobiologically plausible, and empirically approachable set of practices for the specific project of clarifying human consciousness from the 12-fold structure of its conditioned limitations. It was suppressed not because it was threatening in any politically naive sense. It was suppressed because it was threatening in the most fundamental sense. It offered human beings a path to direct, unmediated knowledge of the quality of awareness that is their deepest nature, a path that required no priestly intermediary, no institutional approval, no hierarchical certification of spiritual progress. It offered, in other words, exactly what religious authority most consistently fears: the direct, personal, verifiable experience of something that renders external authority unnecessary. That is why Friday the 13th was made feared, not because of the Templars alone, though their destruction on that date was part of the campaign, not because of medieval superstition alone, though superstition was the vehicle through which the inversion was transmitted to popular consciousness, but because the combination of the sixth day, the day of Sophia, the day of the divine feminine, the day of the principle that knows and teaches from direct experience rather than from hierarchy, with the number 13, the number of the consciousness that transcends the 12-fold structure of archonic control, represented to those who understood what it meant the most direct possible symbolic expression of spiritual liberation. What was made most feared was, in truth, most sacred. Not in the sense of belonging to an institutional religion, not in the sense of requiring special initiates or secret knowledge, sacred in the original sense, set apart, charged with significance, oriented toward what is most real and most deeply human. The recognition of this, the moment when you see the inversion for what it is and choose to move toward rather than away from what was made feared, is itself a practice. It is itself a moment of liberation. It is itself a turning toward Sophia and away from the archonic conditioning that told you to look elsewhere. This is where practical work and historical understanding become inseparable, because every time you engage with the Friday the 13th practice, you're doing something that has a genuine historical context. You're participating in the ongoing project of recovering knowledge that was deliberately removed from human consciousness, not because it was dangerous, but because it was liberating. And that participation, that conscious alignment with a long lineage of practitioners who chose the same orientation, is not a fantasy. It is a real act. It creates real effects. And those effects, documented honestly over time, become the most convincing argument possible for the reality of what the Gnostic tradition was pointing toward. The Gospel of Mary ends with a scene of controversy and resolution. After Mary delivers the private teachings of Jesus, after Peter and Andrew reject them, a third disciple named Levi speaks. He is rarely discussed in the scholarship, but his words in this context are among the most important in the entire text. "Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. Now I see you contending against this woman as against adversaries. But if the teacher considered her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the teacher knew her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Rather let us be ashamed and put on the perfect man. Let us separate as he commanded and preach the gospel, not laying down any other rule or other law beyond what the teacher said. Levi's intervention restores the original teaching not by winning an argument, but by redirecting attention to what actually matters: the practice, the going out, the living of what has been learned. The content of the teaching is not the point. The transmission of it into lived experience is the point. Friday the 13th is not a magical date. It is an invitation to the practice that the gospel describes. The practice of moving toward what was made feared, of recognizing in the feared and the suppressed the presence of what is most sacred, of gathering in the name of the consciousness that transcends all 12-fold limitation, and of carrying that recognition, not as doctrine, not as certainty, but as working hypothesis, into the texture of ordinary daily life. That is where this documentary leaves you. Not with a mystical experience, not with certainty about cosmic beings and their campaigns against human liberation, but with a practice, a framework, a historical context, a neurobiological account, and an invitation to find out for yourself. The Gnostic texts are not asking for faith, they are asking for engagement. They are asking you to try the recognition turn, to prepare a space, to speak the invocation, to make the declaration, to spend 30 days tracking your own results with the same rigor you would bring to any meaningful investigation, and then, at the end of those 30 days, to report back, not to any teacher, not to any community, not to the comment section of a video, but to your own honest awareness. What has shifted? What has become more visible? What quality of consciousness has become even slightly more consistently available that was not available before? These are the questions that the practice is designed to make answerable, not philosophically, not theologically, but experientially in the data of your own moment-to-moment life. The day that was made most feared is the day on which that investigation most richly repays effort. Start where you are, begin with what you have. The recognition turn costs nothing and requires nothing except 10 minutes and sincere attention. From that beginning, everything else becomes possible, not because of magic, not because of cosmic intervention, but because the quality of awareness you are turning toward is in the Gnostic framework and in the testimony of every serious practitioner who has spent years in this work, already present in you, already your deepest nature, already the ground from which everything else in your experience arises. You are not conditioned to know that. The 12-fold structure of your conditioning was built, layer by careful layer, to ensure you would not know that. It told you to look for what you most deeply are in external authorities, in institutional endorsements, in the validation of others, in anything except your own direct, careful, sustained investigation of what you actually are at the deepest level of your experience. Friday the 13th says otherwise. The day of Sophia, the day of the wisdom that knows from inside, not from outside, combined with the number of the consciousness that transcends the 12-fold structure of its own limitations, says, the most important investigation you will ever undertake is available to you right now, in this moment, with no other resources than your own attention and your own honest commitment to see what is actually there. That is the teaching. That is what was suppressed. That is what is now, in this moment, being made available again. Not because of this documentary, not because of any authority or transmission or institutional endorsement, but because the quality of awareness that the Gnostic tradition calls Sophia, the quality of consciousness that the texts call monad, the quality of being that every contemplative tradition in every culture that has engaged seriously with these questions has described in its own vocabulary, is your own most fundamental nature. It was never lost. it was only obscured. And the Friday the 13th practice, engaged with sincerity and rigour over time, is a reliable, historically tested, philosophically coherent technology for gradually, consistently, irreversibly making that obscuration more transparent. The investigation is yours to conduct. The results are yours to evaluate. The practice begins whenever you begin it. 7 days from now, or 7 hours, or on the next Friday, or on the next Friday the 13th, or in the next 10 minutes when this documentary ends and you close your eyes and ask yourself, with full honest attention, what is the quality of awareness that is reading these words, having this experience sitting here in this particular life at this particular moment? What is that? Not the thoughts about that, not the feelings about that, not the beliefs or the conditioning or the archonic patterns that immediately rush in to answer with their 12-sphere version of reality, but the awareness itself, the thing that is aware of all of those things. What is it? Turn toward it. Rest there. And whatever you find, report back to it, honestly, every morning, every Friday, every lunar cycle, every year that you continue the work. Because the tradition promises, and the practitioners confirm, and the neuroscience is beginning to explain, in that consistent, honest, rigorously empirical turning of attention toward its own most fundamental nature, something opens that cannot be closed again. Something is recognized that cannot be unrecognized. And from that recognition, not as a destination but as an ongoing practice of return, the 12-sphere structure of conditioned limitation gradually, non-linearly, inconsistently, but directionally loses its grip. That is liberation. Not as an event, as a direction, as a practice, as the ongoing work of what the Gospel of Mary calls the perfect man, the fully actualized human being, neither male nor female in the gender-limited sense, but complete, both analytical and receptive, both structured and open, both grounded in the 12 and oriented toward the 13th, both fully in the world and fully aware of what lies beyond the world's conditioning. Friday the 13th is the calendar's reminder. Once a year, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, the calendar offers this particular combination of the day of Sophia and the number of liberation, and invites the practitioner to do what the tradition has always invited, to recognize what is sacred in what was made feared, to move toward rather than away, and to find in that movement the most direct path to what is most real. Begin there, continue from there, share what you find. Not in the form of certainty, the tradition does not offer certainty, but in the form of your own honest, specific, rigorously observed experience. Because that kind of sharing among practitioners working with the same material in their own unique lives is the contemporary form of what the Gnostic tradition called the gathering of 12, the circle in which the 13th, the quality of transcendent awareness, is present not as a person but as an orientation, a shared commitment to something that cannot be fully named but that can be directly known. You're not asked to believe any of this. You are asked to find out. Find out